Hi, good afternoon. Good to see you, the diehards of poverty and climate change here. It's good to have you, and it's particularly great to see that this report, who's been a long time in the making, is finally out. And as you may know, it got really good coverage in the press. And I think it's a report that's really making an impact and coming at a really good time just before COP21. So the way we will proceed is Stéphane, who's the lead author of the report, Stéphane Algat, is going to present it. And then we'll have two panelists, so John Room, who's our director for climate change, as well as Chico Ferreira, who's the senior advisor on poverty in the research department. And both of them will talk about the implications in the link with basically the poverty literature and the poverty work that the bank is doing. And John will also tell us more about what this implies for the bank, both on the way to COP21, but also in the post-COP21 in the January 1st, what it'll mean at that time. So without any further ado, Stéphane, why don't you go ahead and present the report?
No? Okay, so maybe I will have to be stuck behind this thing. It's working? Okay. So thank you very much, Mayan, for the introduction. Thanks for coming for this presentation. First thing, we have some of the team sitting in the front, and our editor is also here. So a lot of the work has been done by them and with them. So I just want to thank them and recognize the huge amount of work that has been done for this report in the last something like 18 months. I did not count, but it's an approximation. So I will now go through the main messages of this report, but before doing that, I just wanted to give a sense of why we started doing that. So the goal of this report was really to take together two of the main goals of the international community and of the World Bank Group: the eradication of extreme poverty by 2030 and the climate change challenge, and to try to see what we could learn by looking at these two challenges together and trying to see how we can achieve these goals more efficiently if we take them into account together in an integrated strategy. So it really started from some of the frustration with the conversation about the difference between like development finance, for instance, and climate finance, and a strong feeling that these two things were really building on each other, and that we needed to take them into account together in one strategy without opposing them. We also wanted to look at poverty because a lot of the discussion on the impact of climate change is about the economic impact and is about the impact on income and GDP. And the problem with that is, at the global level, by looking at GDP and global income, you're mostly looking at high-income regions. So we're not really looking at the impact on sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, which is only 3% of the global GDP. So whatever happens in sub-Saharan Africa has a very small impact on the global income and global GDP. And within countries, it's exactly the same thing. Most of the people we're looking at in this report, people in poverty and extreme poverty, do not really count in the national GDP because they are so poor that they don't have a lot of income, and so they don't contribute a lot. So what happens to them is largely independent on what happens to the global national aggregates. So to look at this question, and that's maybe the main innovation of the report, we did not start by looking at the impact of climate change on national economies and then the implication for poverty. We started from poverty. We started from household surveys, looking at the situation of poor people at the household level, and we looked at the impact on households, on families, on people, and then tried to look at the consequences at the economic level, but really taking the problem in the opposite direction, starting at the individual level. So let me go through the three main messages of this report. The first one is, when you look at poverty today and what you see in household surveys, you see that climate-related shocks and stresses are already an obstacle to poverty eradication. So this is not something that climate change will create in the future. That's something that we observe and measure
today. Let me just start with one example to illustrate that. This is a study done on 36 villages in India, in Andhra Pradesh, where households have been followed over more than 25 years. And what we find is if you look at these people and you classify them as poor or non-poor, you find that every year, 14% of them, 14% of households are escaping poverty every year. So if poverty reduction was a one-way road, in just a few years, we would have no poverty left. Problem is, every year, you get 12% of households falling back. And the net effect, this small 2% per year in poverty reduction that we have, is the difference between these two flows. What the consequence of this is, if you increase the flow getting back into poverty just a little bit, from 12 to 13%, nothing, you divide by 2 the rate of poverty reduction. Or if you decrease slightly the flow getting out of poverty from 14 to 13, you get the same thing. If you do the two things, you don't have poverty reduction anymore. So we know that even a small impact on these flows can have a huge impact on what we're looking at and what we want, which is a net effect on poverty. And when you ask people in these 36 villages why they fell into poverty, 44% of the cases are related to drought, irrigation failure, or crop disease. Things which are linked to climate conditions and climate change. Same thing, if we want to look at what prevents people from escaping poverty, again, we find climate events. We find, for instance, floods destroying all the assets that people try to accumulate to escape poverty. So looking at what happens to households today, we feel that the impact of climate change, because it affects these flows, can very easily have a very large impact on the net poverty reduction that we observe every year. So we have many other surveys like this. If you look at them, what we find is that there are 3 main reasons why people are falling back in poverty or have trouble to escape. Spikes in food prices and shocks to agricultural income or ecosystem-based income. Second one is natural disasters, floods, droughts, heat waves, storms. And the third one are the disease and health shocks, including malaria, diarrhea, and children stunting, which are linked to climate conditions too. So we looked at the 3 categories, and we find that it's not the case everywhere, it's not the case always, but in most cases, the 3 categories of shocks will get worse because of climate change. So when we say, and we have said it before, that climate change is a threat to poverty eradication, it's not something based on some long-term modeling and so on. Is we observe the problems we have today, and we see that these problems will get worse. So it's really based on what people say today. The other thing that we did, on which we don't have a lot of evidence, and we had a lot of original work to try to provide more quantification and evidence upon, is the fact that poor people are more exposed and more often affected by all of these shocks. Let me just give you an example on Nigeria. We looked at floods, and we find that poor people are 50% more likely to be flooded every year. Drought, 130%. Very extreme heat, 80% more likely to be affected. And Nigeria it's an interesting case. If you look at households in Nigeria and you plot them with temperature on the x-axis and their wealth on the y-axis, you get this relationship. So it's almost like a linear trend with the poorest people living in the warmest places. So I show this case, it's a bit cheating because it's one case that's really is very impressive. But we find that in most countries we've been looking at, there is a correlation between bad climate situations and poverty numbers. This is, for instance, for urban floods. And you see the 52 countries where we could run similar analysis. So this is just for floods. I mean, the image is not really clear, but all the countries in orange are countries where poor people are more affected to urban floods than the rest of the population. You see countries in green. There are countries where poor people are less affected than the average. So there are countries where it's the case. And countries in gray are cases where it's not significant, so we cannot see anything.
Sorry to interrupt, Stefan. Maybe somebody could turn off these lights on the podium to make the PowerPoint a bit more visible.
Yeah. So, I mean, we can get into all of this data at the country level to try to guide policies, but looking at the big picture, in most cases, and it's not a big surprise, we find that poor people are not living in the best place and they are living in the most risky areas. What's even more important is not where these poor people live, it's how much they lose when they get hit. And a lot of the difference between poor and non-poor people is happening there. So these are 3 case studies of disasters that happened in the past, and we looked at how much people lost in fraction of their wealth, depending on whether they are poor or non-poor. And you see that poor people are losing between twice and 3 times more relative to their wealth than non-poor people. So in Mumbai, after the 2005 floods, for instance, poor people lost more than twice as much as non-poor people. And we looked at the reasons, and the first one is the portfolio of assets of poor people compared with non-poor people. Non-poor people have bank accounts. Bank accounts don't get flooded. Poor people in rural areas, they have livestock. Livestock is very vulnerable to every weather-related event. But in urban areas, we know that people save by improving their home. That's the first thing they invest in. So if the home is washed away, they have lost everything and they have to start from zero. So the type of assets they have is really important. And of course, in addition to this, the quality of these assets is very different. Rich people are more likely to live in nice houses that can bear floods than people living in a slum or in informal settlements. And it's the same thing for infrastructure. Poor people are more likely to live next to roads that are not paved and more vulnerable to floods. So poor people are more often affected. When they're affected, they lose more. And to make everything worse, they are much more alone facing these shocks. So we looked at the support they get from families and friends and remittances, from the financial system, and from social protection. And this is the case from Indonesia, for instance. We find that poor people are systematically less supported by all of these systems. And that's especially the case if we compare Indonesia and Malawi. The poorest country you look at, the lower the support, but always we find that poor people in the country are less supported. So the implication of this is really that not only natural disasters and all these climate-related events are keeping people in poverty, but also poor people are suffering more, which means that you can imagine that in some countries, middle income and rich countries are not affected that much, so you don't get a big impact on GDP and income, but still you're creating poverty pockets because people are affected repeatedly by the event. It also means that when we're doing things that sometimes we qualify as climate change adaptation, investing in dikes, investing in drainage systems and so on, we're improving the ability of these poor people to cope with these shocks, and we're doing poverty reduction. So a lot of the projects that are qualified as climate change adaptation and resilience are today reducing poverty already. The second main message is looking in the future, and while the first one is more depressing, this one tries to look at what can be done and find that a lot can be done. What we find looking at 2030 is that if we assume that development is rapid, that it is inclusive, so everybody benefits, and that it is informed by what we know about climate change, most of the consequences of climate change on poverty can be prevented by 2030. The other side of the coin is if we don't do this, the stakes are really high, and more than 100 million more people could be in extreme poverty just because of climate change in 2030. So just to explain what we did, we start from the idea that the same event, the same flood or heavy precipitation, has very different implications depending on what is affected. So the impact of climate change by 2030 will depend on whether development works well between now and 2030 or not. So to look at this, we looked at two scenarios without climate change. One optimistic, and especially we have this rapid and inclusive development in which everybody benefits, and one that is more pessimistic, the poverty scenario, where we have less economic growth, more inequalities, and so on. And we look at climate change impact in these two different scenarios. This is what we get for the optimistic socioeconomic development. Still, we find some impact. So countries in red, for instance, are countries where more than 6% of the population is taken in poverty by climate change. And you see that most of the impacts are in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. But what's mostly of interest to us is to compare with a scenario in which we don't have this rapid and inclusive development. And in that case, impacts are much higher than that. You still see the same regions being mostly affected, but the amplitude of the impact is much larger. So the comparison of these two maps give you a sense of what development can achieve. With this good development, we're talking about impacts will be much, much lower than with a slow development. So what do we mean by this good and inclusive development? So in the report, we're looking at what makes a difference. What makes a difference, for instance, in agriculture is better education and access to the best agricultural practice, better transport infrastructure to make sure we access markets better, and so on. So these are things that we're talking about in the agriculture sector with or without climate change, but we find that it makes a big difference. We looked at financial inclusion that protect people against all shocks and what can be done with mobile banking and so on. Again, these are things that we're talking about with or without climate change, but we find that it really helps make people more resilient. We have a lot on social protection in this report because we feel it can make a big difference in how people manage shocks. And we're looking at how social protection needs to be designed as a package of things able to deal with the big events and very intense events and the smaller ones, but also different tools for poor households and richer ones. And only if you have a package of very different things, you can protect your entire population against all of the shocks we're talking about. So we're looking at how basic social protection and diversification help with small shocks, how access to financing tools and savings can help with bigger shocks, but mostly rich households, the role of market insurance, and the role of social insurance that can be scaled up after a shock. We're also looking at how to finance these different tools from a government perspective, including a lot of things that the World Bank Group is doing, helping countries put together reserve funds, access to insurance and contingent finance, and also the role of crisis management, such as the crisis response window of IDA, for instance. So the point we wanted to make in there is the need for this very large approach, not looking at one solution as the solution to all problems, but this combination of tools. We also look at universal health coverage and healthcare, looking at the case of Rwanda, who did huge progress in providing basic health coverage to the population. More than 80% of the population is now covered. So at that point, you might think, this guy is talking about development. He's not talking so much about climate change. And if you think that, that's great, because that's one point we wanted to make, that a lot of what we need to cope with climate change impact, it's about development. And it's about good development, taking into account what climate change will change. But a lot of what we do, even in sectors that are not in the climate domain, like education projects, if it takes people out of poverty, it makes them more resilient to shocks and it reduces climate change impact. So this is a really important conclusion of this work. We also look at what we need to do slightly differently because of climate change. So I won't get into all of these details because, I mean, we have many examples in the report and I want you to read it. But we have these different things. Just two examples. Looking at social protection, we look at the reactivity of social protection and how we can use social protection to help people fast before we need humanitarian intervention. And we have many examples in Ethiopia, in Brazil, in the Philippines, and in Pakistan of how this has been done in very different contexts. So I invite you to just look at these examples. We also discuss this question of how to design projects with long-term consequences, knowing that there is climate change and there is a big uncertainty on climate change. I won't get into the details, but it's not any development that's needed. We need this development to take into account what's different because there is climate change. So finally, the third message is about the long term. So right now, I told you about 2030, and just to show you 2030, these are the projection of temperature from the IPCC. 2030 is a small green box here. So we're talking about the short-term climate change, which is relatively limited compared with this huge box, which is a challenge for the century and beyond. So when we look at the longer term, we find that there are limits to what good development and adaptation can achieve. Just to give you one example, this is availability of of food, so it's calories per capita in sub-Saharan Africa. And the green line here is without climate change. When you have this convergence with access to food getting where 100% is where rich countries are at right now. If you look at the red or the orange lines, these are just an optimistic and pessimistic projection with an abated climate change. And you see that we might have a stop in the convergence of poor regions toward where we are in rich countries now because of climate change. And this is taking into account adaptation and trade. So at one point, there are limits to what adaptation can do, and we really need at the same time to work on mitigation and reducing emissions. In the report, we're repeating that stabilizing climate change at any level means bringing CO2 emissions to zero, more or less at the end of the century. So the goal is not to reduce by 20%, but really get to zero. This means that development needs to be done differently, and especially providing energy access to the people lacking it today needs to be done in a way that's consistent with these climate change goals if we want to prevent climate change from running away. The report, and I'll conclude on that, look at how we can do this without slowing down poverty reduction. And we're basically saying three things. First, if you look especially at developing and low-income countries, there are huge potentials for co-benefit and synergies between development and reducing emissions. So reducing congestion by replacing all of these cars by public transport, for instance, is something that reduces emissions, but if you have been in one of those big Asian cities recently, it's also key for the efficiency of the economy locally. So it also would create jobs and help people get out of poverty. And we have many examples of other co-benefits: air quality, water management, or like cooking and replacing the use of traditional biomass with all of the impacts on children. In all of these domains, we have lists of policies that reduce emissions and contribute to development and poverty reduction. And we can make climate and environmental policies such that they benefit poor people. So this is an example on 20 countries with fossil fuel subsidies, assuming that you take away $100 in fossil fuel subsidies, and we use this money with a universal cash transfer. So you give the same amount to poor and rich people in your country. And what you get is 60% of the population benefit, so 60% the poorest, and you get the bottom quintile, like a net beneficiary of this change. So thinking about the poverty impact, for instance, of energy taxes or carbon taxes or removing of fossil fuel subsidies, the impact on poverty and on distribution is not so much about the removal of the subsidy or the introduction of the tax. It's about what we do with the money. And if we use this money to help poor people or to invest in infrastructure they need and so on, poor people can benefit from these policies. At the same time, we repeat that in very poor countries where most of the population is poor, even if only the top of the distribution is affected, this is a problem because everybody is poor in this country. So in countries with very low income and low GDP per capita, the only way to kill any trade-offs between climate change mitigation and poverty reduction is through international community providing support to make sure we never do emission reductions at the expense of poverty reduction. So just to conclude, this is my last slide. So it's very difficult to to transform this material into a positive story, but in the end, the takeaway is positive. The takeaway is we can do it. We have this list of recommendations and policies that can make sure that, on the one hand, we avoid the impacts of climate change that cannot be prevented with emission reductions, because the climate will continue to warm in the next decades. So there is a lot that we need to do with vulnerability reduction and adaptation, but we know how we can do this, and it's a lot about poverty reduction. And for the long-term impacts that cannot be avoided with development and adaptation, we know how to do emission reductions and mitigation in a way that benefit poor people and doesn't go against poverty reduction. So this, I would like to make it really the main message of the report being about what can be done and the fact that we can do it. And it remains the implementation challenge, which I think will be the topic of the discussion later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefan. We'll now turn to our discussant. Chico, I think we'll start with you.
Thanks, Marianne, and thanks very much to Stefan for a really excellent presentation. You know, I've been around this place now for almost 20 years, I'm ashamed to admit. And so in this time, I've seen my share of reports. And I really think this one ranks at, you know, very high in the sort of top range of these reports that I've seen. In particular, I mean, it's hugely ambitious. It's a hugely ambitious report, as you saw. Stefan described, you know, his presentation range from climate shocks, which are at the root, the exogenous thing that's going on here, but he talked about transport policy, he talked about social protection, he talked about health, he talked about agriculture. So the canvas is a very, very broad one, and it's global. It's not about one particular place. So they really took a lot on their plate, and I'm looking at this is part of your team here. Yeah. So all of these guys did.
Yes, exactly.
Huh?
The ones looking back at them.
Exactly. So they took a lot on, and in my view, they managed to deliver, and they managed to deliver in two ways. Stefan, I think wisely, didn't talk a lot about the underpinning economic analysis behind it, but there actually, I've seen some of it before, there actually is quite a lot of work in constructing these scenarios, which are actually summaries of a variety of other modeling that was done, which was not always necessarily uncontroversial. I remember trying to learn a lot about the methods that they use in there, but you know, it's cutting edge, and it's a lot of solid analytical work. But then, and this is where we often fail at the bank as well. We fail in many things, but one of them is even when we try to do that work, then when we come to present it in kind of policy relevant terms, people get lost, there isn't a story, it's not clear. And I've really been impressed by Stefan and the team's ability to tell a very cogent, coherent, powerful story. So what I'm going to say now, I'm going to have to earn my free bottle of water by giving some comments and criticisms. But whatever I say should be seen in the context of that, which I'm really impressed by this. Let me actually start. I think Stefan's presentation was very clear with his three main messages. But if you guys are anything like me, you've already forgotten what those three main messages are, because I always sit at presentations and go, okay, what? So let me summarize, rephrase a little bit what the three main messages of this thing are, my takeaway. So the first one is that there's this big shock, this, you know, climate change is happening, is real, and it's not distribution neutral. The poor are particularly vulnerable to it for the obvious reasons that he described. I mean, primarily, better off people are better able to allocate assets, reallocate assets, protect them, and so on. So the poorer you are, the more likely you are to be vulnerable to those three main channels. Within this discussion of vulnerability, they emphasize these three main channels, sort of agriculture and food, natural disasters, and health and disease. And not everywhere in all three, but broadly across all three of those channels, the poor are likely to suffer the most from climate change. So that's message one. Then message two is, but lo and behold, doing development well, doing a whole bunch of things that we want to be doing in any case, turns out to be highly protective of the poor against those climate things. And you get to correct me afterwards if I've misrepresented you too much. But that was my reading of message number two. And then message number three is, but don't be complacent about this idea that doing development well protects the poor, because that's primarily about a medium run. And if we just let climate change run amok, we will have very serious problems in the longer term. So mitigation, immediate mitigation, is still needed. And then there's another bit of good news there, which is the claim that that mitigation now is actually unlikely to be very bad for the poor now. Because there's some argument, you know, and you hear it often, actually you hear it in Africa quite often, that, well, you know, now that the Germans have already burned down all their forests and have grown rich, they're going to tell us not to do it or not to build power dams or whatever, and that's going to be bad for poverty reduction. So there's a claim here that that's not necessarily true. Right, so that's kind of my brief summary of that. Now, three comments, and I don't really have that much to say, just three comments. One, that on message 2, that the attempt of the team to be very holistic, very comprehensive, is on the one hand welcome, yet on the other they had, all these different scenarios, and maybe Stefan at the end, I don't know if there's going to be time, can tell us a little bit more about just the basic scheme of the methodology for people about all these different scenarios that were simulated. But in the end, for presentational reasons, they ended up conflating them in these two kind of, it's a 2x2 matrix, right? It's good development, bad development, good climate policy, bad climate policy. And the thing that makes the most difference is the good development. But this good development conflates too many things, is my criticism, right? So it's if you read the presentation, it says it's rapid, inclusive, and climate informed, I think is the. But then, if you're an economist, you're thinking, well, what is it that matters most? Is it that it's rapid? So it's just growth, dollar and cray? Or is it that it's inclusive? I mean, is it the protection that's really important? And inclusive how? Is it mostly education or social protection? So all of these things that you then start to want to unpack become somewhat less clear because, as I say, they had to deal with this challenge of presenting in digestible way what is really complex. Also because, and then I don't know if I'm going to overstep my mark here, but my recollection is that a lot of the modeling that they used, and every time Stefan and I talk, he has to explain this again to me, so he'll probably have to do it again today. But the modeling that they use is one that deliberately avoids probability distributions associated with things. And it's a kind of minimizing the maximum risk or something like that. So because you avoid these probability distributions, that also makes it harder to say, in expectation, what is it that's most important to protect people from poverty. So that's my first comment. My second comment is a smaller one, and that is I really liked their grouping of these 3 key channels of impact: agriculture and food. And they conflate things too. So here there's agricultural productivity to the farmer. There's also food prices to the urban dweller, but they've grouped them nicely there: agriculture and food, natural disasters, and health and disease. But then I wonder, there are people who claim that climate change may have reasonable impacts on conflict and on migration. And on migration both directly and indirectly through their impact on conflict. And whilst those may not be hugely important in all regions of the world, and maybe the 3 that they chose are the most important, they might be very important in some of the poorest and most wretched places. And having worked on Africa recently for a couple of years, certainly I can think of a few places in Africa where, if Ted Miguel of Berkeley, for example, is right, that there is some evidence out there that climate change is associated with a more pronounced risk of conflict. And there's some serious work by Ted and others on that I'm not an expert on, but these guys know better than me. Then there could be additional channels through conflict and migration there. And perhaps they're in the report, which I haven't had a chance to read in full, but they're not in the main summary. And so I wanted to ask the authors whether they think that could be an additional thing. And if so, that perhaps those channels lead to additional caution with some of the optimistic takeaway. Although I think the optimistic takeaway is important. Right. So my last, I think we all want to hear from John on what we're actually going to do in response to all this. So I just have one more point, and that is, again, vaguely sort of repetitive, I'm sure, to all of you. But once you start thinking about this, you think of the political economy problem of addressing this. So maybe there will be a segue into John. I don't know. But the political economy problem of dealing with climate change, particularly when you bring the distributional dimension into it, is kind of an economist's nightmare, right? It's like a 2-layered conundrum. And the 2 layers are as follows. First of all, if you abandon politics and collective action and you think just of agents in markets, it's the perfect sort of global tragedy of the commons. The problem is analogous to a prisoner's dilemma in very large scale. The dominant strategy for me is to keep driving my non-fuel efficient car, because whatever I do is tiny, relative to everybody else, right? So the dominant strategy for everybody is to sort of ignore this and hope other people will adapt to it. And this is a prisoner's dilemma, and it's the global tragedy. It's a tragedy of the commons, and it's a tragedy of the commons that is global in nature, because what you do in China affects what happens here. What you do in Oklahoma affects how people live in Nairobi, and so on. So then, when there is a big coordination failure like that, the typical answer is public action. That moves us to the second layer of the political economy problem, and that is that for public action, first of all, public action typically relies on a government, but there is no global government, contrary to people who believe there are black helicopters hovering around. There are global institutions, but there is no global government per se, as we know from the difficulty of establishing a price for carbon, for example. So we need coordination and cooperation. And then what this report makes you think about is, well, if the people who are most affected by this are the poor, and the people who can best protect themselves against it are the well-off, but then remember that the well-off have the biggest voice. They have the biggest voice and the most power, both across countries and within countries. You might think, well, why are there so many African leaders, for example, who don't seem to worry about climate change at all, if in fact their countries will be affected by it? Well, part of it may be a issue of information. Another part may be an issue of political economy within those countries, and the fact that the people who make a lot of the decisions are actually quite capable of moving to Switzerland and living in those beautiful houses that we saw over there, right? So this leads me to at least one very small aspect of what we might do about it, which is a plea to John and Marianne here on this panel, that this, if we ever had an opportunity to, think of a high benefit to cost ratio of disseminating a report, then this is it. Because what I think, the way you change that political economy scenario is to bring the sort of, if there is a benign middle class somewhere, people who say, think of all these Europeans who are really into climate change and so on, right? And there are people all over the world like that as well. It's because we can make them aware of this sort of situation and say, look, first of all, and this is the nice thing about the messages, first of all, yes, there is a problem. The poor are likely to be most affected, okay? But B, there are solutions. There are difficult solutions. They range across a wide range of different policies. But if we do that stuff, maybe it won't all be that bad. So making that case very strongly around the world, including in developing countries where the, voters and middle classes can affect their leaders, could somehow help break this political economy logjam that I've tried to describe. So again, kudos to Stefan, Marianne, and the team, and thanks for the chance to be here.
Thank you, Chico, and now we'll turn to John.
Very good, thank you, Chico.
What are we going to do?
Yes, so thank you very much, and thank you very much to the team, and as I'll come to later, including to the external ECR team that got some of this stuff out. I think they did a great job in terms of getting it out, but I'll come to that in a minute. And thank you very much, Chico, for your comments. I think that the political economy of making change on this is indeed very complex. I think you've identified two issues. One is the global commons. The other one is the poor versus the non-poor. The third issue is the generational aspect. Because what you saw here were 15, 20 years of medium impact, and then this huge impact 2030, 2040, 2050 out. And if you think that most politicians have maybe got a 3-year time horizon for their next election, there's an intergenerational issue that we have to deal with. So a few things that we're doing and a few things that we're trying to do. So the one thing that we've done already is indeed to try and get this communicated and disseminated as far as we can. Not only using traditional means, but using Twitter, using Facebook, using television. Stefan and I have been running, and Marianne have been running around from TV studio to TV studio and coming back to the bank with makeup on our faces and people wondering what's going on to try and get these messages out. The short-term positioning has been trying to at least position it to try and shape the debate in Paris. And interestingly, the French minister in charge of COP21, at his press conference after the pre-COP21 meeting, the first thing he did was reference our report, basically saying this is a need for action along this. We've got to have the poor, and we've got to focus on the impact on some poor people. And hopefully by getting this released now, we're getting this on the agenda of people with this focus on poor people early on, and to try and figure out how we can shape that. So I think this is the first, and we'll take it much further. Second opportunity would then be to drill this down into country-level dialogue at the country level strategically and internally within the bank. So on Monday, I'll be in Senegal for the IDA midterm review, but on Monday we've set up a 3-hour meeting with key counterparts in the Senegalese government from finance, from environment, some of the other line ministries, and a few civil society people as well. And we will basically go through some of the issues raised here, but drill down to what this might mean for Senegal. So we take the climate impacts, not only globally, but then drill down for Africa, and using some of the work that's come out of the GFDRR teams and other stuff. What does this mean in Senegal specifically? So what might the impacts be on agriculture? What is flooding relative to where people are living? So we can share this. Then go through a process of allowing the government to describe what they're going to do and our teams to describe what we're going to do. But then after that, I will then respond with some targeted good practices, many of them drawn from this, but also from other work that we've done around, essentially in the case of Senegal, flooding management and agriculture management, with the idea of trying to spark this idea that at the country level, we can start addressing these sorts of issues. Now, I think picking up on Chico's comment, I think we should be thinking about country-level dissemination more broadly into the general population, picking up on Facebook and all the rest of it. I do think that this resonates, just to come back to that issue, this does resonate in Facebook and Twitter. We were trending on Twitter for a while, we were trending on Facebook for a while, and just watching people pick this stuff up, I think we're getting a lot of traction on these kinds of media. Second operational thing, looking a bit more internally within the bank, would be to use this analysis, at least at the level it is, and then drill down in a few specific places to try and shape the discussion around the SCDs, the Strategic Country Diagnosis. So the SCDs are ongoing, and some of our staff provide comments in a sort of a fairly loose way, but in a much more structured way to be involved in the SCDs, to bring this perspective into the SCDs and then into the CPFs. Now, at the very least, to start with, what we will certainly do is try and find ways of providing that as a sort of an informal feedback, which relies on us doing it. But one of the ideas that was proposed, and I suspect we're going to adopt it, at the W1 strategic budget process that senior management had last week, Laura Tuck actually proposed that we formalize this relationship so that we bring climate considerations and sustainability considerations much, much more clearly into the reviews of the SCDs and find a structured way to try and bring this kind of analysis into that dialogue. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of issues of educating the country directors. Because I think that there are some, this kind of work does imply some strategic choices that have to be made in terms of our country program. So in terms of what we do in a country program, I think this has some important stuff. And so that might include and to answer a little bit of Chico's questions, of the good development, where are the priorities in good development? And in terms of the targeted adaptation, where are those areas that we need targeted adaptation in each country? What is that? So I think there's a big contribution there. The other piece would be around screening individual projects for climate change impacts in general and impact on the poor. Now, we're already doing this pretty much. We've committed to do this for IDA operations, and we're doing it for IDA operations. I think the idea will be to start doing this for IBRD operations as well. Whether we formalize that or not, we need to figure out. We'll be going to the board with a climate action plan in February, and so this will be reflected in there. I think that this does have some implications which maybe haven't been spelled out quite so specifically. And that is, we can talk about doing climate smart and climate informed development. And in general, in most cases, it makes sense to do it. So investing in resilient infrastructure, be it roads or irrigation, it's cheaper to do it now than to wait and clean up later. Okay, so clearly from an intertemporal perspective and from a point of a choice from a government's perspective, this is a sensible thing to do. However, there is a downside. If you have only a certain amount of financing, $100 billion, $10 billion, whatever it is, this resilient infrastructure and targeted adaptation activities are going to cost more. And so for a given amount of investment, you will only have 80% or 75% of the kilometrage of roads that you can build or the irrigation that you can put in place. And so I think that then has some implications in terms of the financing. And what does this mean? So dialogue at the country level in terms of how they prioritize their financing, where does their financing go, but also in terms of many of the poorest countries, what does this mean for international assistance and international aid? And so we will be using this. I will be presenting this material and the video associated with it at the IDA midterm review. And the point that you don't actually beg at the IDA midterm review, but the subtle or not so subtle point we'll be making is that this is going to require, particularly for the poorest countries, as we note, additional international assistance in order to make that happen. And so trying to organize that through these kinds of mechanisms would be important. But then I think we also have to keep working on this energy subsidy issue that we talked about. You know, there's trillions of dollars sitting in wasteful energy subsidies, and we've talked about it. I don't want to pretend that this is a panacea because implementation, particularly with the political economy, can be quite difficult. But I think that is one place where I do think we need to be able to squeeze out some additional financing. And then the other area that we have to focus on a little bit is this question of leveraging private financing to this. And we've touched on it. It's quite difficult on the adaptation side, but certainly on the mitigation side. The amount of money that will be needed to move to a decarbonized economy is going to be huge. It's going to mean a huge amount of reallocation of finances on the private sector side. A lot of that will happen in response to market signals. As solar power prices fall considerably, private sector will move in. But I think we have a real challenge facing us going forward in terms of how we use public finance most effectively to crowd in private sector finance going forward. Because on a public sector basis, you just cannot do all of this stuff together. I suppose I can talk about a lot. Let me try and limit this to a few other things. We will be going to the board with a climate action plan at the end of February, and this will describe what we're going to do in terms of ramping up the work that we're doing on climate. This will be one of the pieces that will shape what that is about. Hopefully this will help us at the board. There are a number of board members that somehow think that climate finance is completely independent from development finance and that there's a dollar for dollar trade-off. I think this will help us with the dialogue to show that they're not entirely orthogonal, although there are some issues that we have to deal with. In developing this action plan, we're very much, and since most of the audience here is sort of internal, we're very much focused on driving this from a dialogue with our regional colleagues and our global practice colleagues, or our regional colleagues and our industry group colleagues within IFC. So we don't want this to be seen as something that's being imposed by a small group of true believers and people sitting in the CCSA, but we're trying to work so that people in the GPs, in the industry groups in IFC and in the regional departments understand what's behind it, and so they can move this forward as a jointly owned action plan. So maybe I'll leave it at that. I'm sure there can be lots of comments and questions that we can go into. But
thank you very much. I'd like to now open it for questions or comments, and I'll start with a question that came in through World Bank Live. While you line up to the mic, so think about the very insightful comments you will make. So this is actually a comment that we often get, I think I've gotten that on the presentation of our last 3 reports. It's the age-old question of, look, growth is what generates climate change, but it's also one of the key drivers of poverty reduction. So are these two things working against each other, the growth that we need in order to reduce poverty, but the growth that is actually fueling the climate change? And the person who asked this question, Mike B, asked, is there a way to move to a negative growth economy or neutral growth economy, say with a whole new view on what economy is and how that is measured? And he's asking if anybody's thinking about these macro transitional ideas. Any questions? Everybody's been stunned into silence. Gladys. Do we need everybody to speak to the mic, or yeah? Do you mind online? Because there are people online.
No, thank you very much for the presentation. I was wondering because you didn't go into the methodology, and so when you explained the mechanisms through which, climate change affect poverty, I saw that you had, food prices, but food prices can be good for farmers, the poor working in agriculture. So, if you can talk a little bit more how these mechanisms affect poverty or how they counter.
For years, we talked about sustainable development, then we talked about green growth. Now it's climate-informed development. But if you talk to countries like India, where there are a huge number of poor people, but at the same time, they are dying to grow fast, and that requires a lot of energy. Mainly, it's going to come from coal. So, if you want to tell a minister from India, how will you tell the story? Because they are looking for their carbon space, their growth, getting people out of poverty, all at the same time.
Stefan, why don't you answer these, and then we'll take another bunch.
So I'll start with the first 30 of them. And so now, just reacting a little bit to the panel comments on the priorities per country. So when we do reports like that, global ones, there is a lot of pressure to deliver like a few recommendations. But at the same time, as soon as you start the analysis, you realize that the priorities will be very context dependent and country dependent. And it's not only, it doesn't depend only on the type of impact that we're expecting, but also on what the country's priorities are. So if in a country you get a lot of interest in urbanization, for instance, and a lot of work in urbanization, the best thing is probably to go there and try to add the climate component to the urbanization, because this is what people are looking at. So there is also a pragmatism component, which means that what we will want to push depends on what the country is interested in, and try to just bring together this climate agenda with the rest. It might be considered a lame excuse not to have priorities per country, but we really think that this cannot be done without an engagement with the country and see what's going on. And for us, that's really the challenge now. Like, it's not only about communicating these results, it's really like using the results as a hook to start a conversation and discuss what can be done and what people are interested in. So this, we hope, we can start as soon as possible. Nevertheless, there is one thing that is really important, is the role of agriculture and food prices, and this is the opportunity to answer your question. So on agriculture, we have 3 different impacts affecting people. One is food prices that affect their ability to buy food and consume. And a lot of poor people are using more than 60% of their budget to buy food. So even a small change in food prices is really an important impact. A second channel is the fact that higher food prices can increase the income of farmers. And the third channel is the fact that if the increase in the food price is due to a reduction in productivity, farmers will just produce lower quantities. So they might sometimes benefit because the impact on price is higher than quantities, and sometimes it's the opposite. When we do the analysis of the 3 channels together, we find that in most places and in most scenarios, the negative overwhelm the positive, and the net effect is an increase in poverty. In some places, you can have the opposite. So if you're in a place in high latitudes, benefiting from increased temperature, so you don't have an impact on productivity and quantities, but the rest of the world is suffering and food prices are increasing, then you might find farmers benefiting, being net beneficiaries. The bad news is this is mostly in high latitudes, so it's mostly in the richer countries.
Can I be unusual and interrupt you there? Because is that why the DRC does better in the worst case scenario than in the previous one?
No, the DRC, glad you asked the question. I could have asked you to do it. So this is the big caution note about using poverty headcounts. In the pessimistic socioeconomic development scenario, poverty is so high in Congo without climate change that there is no much room for climate change to make things worse. That's the only reason DRC is better off. It looks like better off, but it's not better off at all.
It's just that the absolute change in percentage points can't go higher.
Exactly. So it's not really a good
Just
news.
to show I was paying attention to your maps.
No, I'm just, I'm really glad. So, I mean, it's in the text because a lot of people were just like, what? So, but overall, I mean, in that case, like Congo is really one of these places where they have a large impact on productivity. So they are net losers in these places. Second point I wanted to make is on conflict and migration, because yes, this is some sort of a like blind spot of the report. We don't have much on conflict and migrations. We discuss migration more as an adaptive strategy, like the fact that people, especially in rural areas with one member of the households in a city, it creates some diversification of income. And the fact that this, like remittances can increase after a shock means that households are much better protected. And a consequence is the fact that we have to be very careful that what we do to improve adaptation capacity do not lock people in place. We want to keep this ability to move to capture different opportunities. On conflict, the only thing we stress is how having quick response thanks to social protection systems can help avoid the large-scale displacement and the conflict. And again, we're more looking at what can be done and the hopes that if we can deliver support more quickly, we can avoid a lot of this humanitarian intervention that we're witnessing. And I hope that we can bring this message also with the World Humanitarian Summit next year. This complementarity seems to be one of the focus of the summit next year, so it might be useful. On weather growth, I mean the question from Mike B on economic growth and the measurement of this economic growth. I mean, we looked at that mostly in the inclusive green growth that we did a few years ago, stressing that yes, there is a consensus that we can measure economic growth better, taking into account non-market impacts, biodiversity, quality of life, health, and we have a lot at the World Bank Group on this, including the WAVES initiative to measure ecosystem services and how they contribute to the economy, contribution which is not measured in GDP in today's national accounts. At the same time, if we look at poor countries, just no way we can take these people out of poverty without economic growth, like standard GDP growth measured the way it is today. So I think there is a discussion in high-income country on how to measure welfare and how to help design policies by measuring welfare better. It doesn't mean that we can afford to slow down GDP growth in low-income countries. And a side point I wanted to make is the fact that we have been looking at the impact on poverty, but we haven't been looking at all of the interactions between development and climate change. And when we say, for instance, that we can completely protect poor people against the impact of climate policies, it doesn't mean that there is no trade-offs and that everything is possible for zero cost. I mean, there will be trade-offs. There will be higher investment costs. There will be trade-off between what we have now and what we have in 10, 20, and 30 years. So the message is really like on the protection of poor people and try to keep poverty reduction as quick as possible. It doesn't mean that development does not have to be done differently. So the question on India from Manny is really about that. We're not saying that there is no trade-off for India if they decide to increase the share of renewable compared with coal and fossil fuels. We're saying that a lot can be done using all of these co-benefits that we have been talking about. Again, the price of solar and renewables have been dropping, and if we can do better in financing the upfront costs and reducing upfront costs with reducing financing costs, we can even make these technologies more competitive compared with fossil fuels. So there is a lot we can do, but to get emissions to zero, there's just no way this is not implying some trade-offs at some point. So we have to make sure we protect the poor and vulnerable against this trade-off. That's the point we're making. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Any other questions? Please, Nick.
So I have a speculative question for Stefan. I know that this is, and I don't know if you'll be able to answer this or not. I know the study was based on data in 92 countries, right? Low income and middle income as well. Knowing what you know now, if you were to redo this study, and I'm not suggesting you do that,
It was a nervous giggle.
yeah, no, I didn't mean to give these people a heart attack. In rich countries, in developed countries, looking at the vulnerability of poor people in those countries, what do you think you would find that is similar? What do you think you would find that would be different, especially in terms of relative vulnerability to higher income groups?
So I think let me add one question, and that one would be directed to John, which is something I've been puzzling about for the last few days, which is, a main message of this report, once again, is that it's really foolish to try to isolate narrowly defined adaptation action that we really have to do. It's really about good development. And again, Stefan explained what good development was. Yet the way that we account for our climate efforts is really tagged in a very specific way, and one that could in fact lead us to do the wrong thing. So there's been an agreement with the other MDBs about how we're going to tag climate adaptation, what is considered climate adaptation. Do you think there might be some appetite to revisit this? Because I think within the institution and certainly within the sectors, there's a real sense that currently it's just defined far too narrowly.
This one is for you,
I'll
right?
take that one.
Not to answer Nick's question about rich countries and what's different, what's the same. So we have one of the background papers. So I should have said we had about 15 different background papers written by about 50 different researchers in the field. One of them is really looking also at the vulnerability in rich countries, which we don't do in the full report, and looking especially at the question of homeless people, who are of course much more affected by the environment and climate condition than the rest. And there is a lot of evidence that they are the first victims of heat waves, for instance. And so we have this, but I think it's slightly different in the sense that most rich countries have these social protection systems and redistribution systems that can fairly easily cope with a lot of these impacts if there is a willingness to do that. So the infrastructure is already there. Doesn't mean there is not a problem of voice and governance and willingness and so on, but it's very different in contexts where we don't have the infrastructure to provide support to people. So the context is slightly different. One thing that we have looked at also, and I did not mention, is if you look at the activities of people at different income levels, you find that lower income people are more likely to work outside or in places without air conditioning. And this can make a huge difference because some of the new research shows that when you get to extreme temperatures, you have a drop in task productivity. And it's physical productivity, but also cognitive performance that is lowered by higher temperatures. So if poor people are more affected by temperatures because they don't have access to air conditioning and so on, then we could imagine an impact on productivity that then would translate into wages. There is a lot of research going on at the moment on this, and this is discussed in the context of developing countries, but it doesn't mean that the same distributional impacts will not be met in rich countries.
John?
Very good. Just one thought on the distributional impact to look at a country like this. I think you just need to have a look at the impacts of Katrina to see exactly what happened. Or even Sandy, although there was a little bit more mixed depending on where it hits. So I suspect that you will find that poorer people would be affected more than wealthy ones. So this question of the tagging, let me be a little political, a little philosophical about this. On the one hand, I think that Marian's raising a valid point. I think what this report shows, for example, is that if you put in place now a social protection system that was scalable, that is probably a really good thing that you could do in terms of resilience. You're probably not going to get full credit out of the MDB coding system in terms of recognizing that as an adaptation measure. And ultimately, further down the road, I think we probably would want to address that. But I think we also have to recognize why was this MDB coding thing put together? A lot of this was driven by this focus on the $100 billion, which was this commitment that was made in Copenhagen as a transfer from north to south, as a measure of the seriousness by which richer countries would transfer money. And so in order to be able to show that you'd done that, it would have to have credibility with poorer countries so that they would be willing to engage in the process. And so almost by definition, some of those categorizations have been conservative in terms of the way in which they've been put together. And even so, some of this is getting challenged from various sources. My hope is that we are very quickly going to go away from this fixation on the 28% and the tagging and really start figuring out in substance what is it that makes most sense. But I think it's a transition. I don't think it's a bad thing right now to be having people focus on some of these narrowly defined activities. So having people put in place climate resilient crops and cropping systems and not just doing agriculture is not a bad signal, I think, to be sending to people and getting people to focus on it. But in the longer term, yeah, maybe we might need to look at something. But I wouldn't, frankly, right now, I would not spend a lot of time trying to reopen this hornet's nests of tagging. I'd much rather have our teams focusing on how can we actually do stuff on the ground with the client rather than trying to change some of these numbers.
Andrew?
My name is Andrew Losas. I work in the transport and ICT practice, a fair bit on climate change, among other things. This is a really fascinating discussion and report, and I look forward to reading the report. And I'm really glad I came here today because we're going through a lot of the similar thinking. Everyone's preparing for COP21. And if I look at it strictly from my transport perspective, I'd like to hear more about, I know you mentioned transport in the context of agriculture at the beginning of your presentation. I'd like to hear a little bit more about it without, of course, going into all the details of the report, because I find we have kind of a strange conflictual situation in transport, because we need to, on the one hand, decarbonize the economy. We need to decarbonize, and one of the things we're going to do to decarbonize, of course, is to reduce the emissions of transport, probably meaning we'll reduce the amount of transportation, the vehicle kilometers and so on that we have. So on the one hand, we need to think about how we do that. But on the other hand, we're doing a lot of thinking about adaptation, not least in the context of this tagging that you've just been talking about. Adaptation it's one thing to protect the road against washing out when it floods. It's one thing to adapt the transport system. But the conclusion that we're slowly leading toward is that transport itself is an element of adaptation for the society as a whole. Mobility of people, mobility of goods, being able to bring agricultural inputs and products to and from the farm and to the markets. If there's a drought in one part of a country, then where's the food going to come from? How are you going to move the people away? How are you going to bring medical supplies? All that stuff depends upon transportation. So on the one hand, we need to decarbonize and in a way try to put ourselves out of business in transport. On the other hand, we need the mobility services in order to be able to adapt. So anyway, it's the dilemma we're facing. I'd just like to hear more about what you have uncovered on that front.
I'm Luis Maurer with IFC, with energy efficiency. My question at hypothetical level, someone was mentioning about the second edition of your book, and here goes my suggestion. For the second edition, I would encourage you to include the impact of climatic events on power crisis and how power crises are becoming more frequent and widespread. And secondly, how this impacts the poor more than it impacts the rich. And so this, I think it's very much aligned with the comment from our colleague from transportation. So there is the whole element of resilience also embedded, how to make the power system more resilient to cope with increasing demand for air conditioning and all those kinds of loads which are also climate driven.
So to start on that one, that's one of the gaps in the report. This the look at power and electricity as is tourism, for instance. I think it would be an interesting case because it's one of the cases, and the question of transport is also about how do we manage this adaptation and reduction of emissions at the same time. And I think the power sector is exactly in the same situation, being really center place for adaptation and risk management and for emission reductions. And in many of those cases, we can see the synergies that can exist between both. I mean, in New York City after Sandy, a lot of the conversation was about moving away from the grid-only solutions, but having like more like small-scale localized system able to bridge the gap when you have a huge event like that one. And I think in many of the developing countries we're working on, we can imagine similar situations where trying to improve resilience of the system might favor the same kind of technologies than the willingness to reduce emissions. The ability to have like smaller scale systems and more like redundancy in the energy mix. So I fully agree that this would be a great addition, and I'm sure one of the people in the front row will want to do it starting tomorrow. On transport, so we're looking at transport as a solution, as you suggest. In rural areas, we're really looking at how it helps people like access market, and we have numbers like reduction by 7% of poverty in Ethiopia following the when you bring paved roads to villages, or the fact that the volatility of food prices is reduced when you get better transport, which is not the surprise because you smooth production shocks over a larger area. In urban areas, I think this might be like more of a new thing, like saying like instead of trying and failing in many cases to ban constructions in at-risk areas, it might be much more efficient to use the transport infrastructure to try to drive new urbanization into safer places or places that are easier and cheaper to protect. So trying to get like a positive approach on risk management. I mean, I've been involved in many of these projects where you bring maps of where you should not build to policymakers and decision makers, and it doesn't flow very well. So having like a very positive approach is important, and transport is really critical on that. On the link with mitigation and emission reductions, I mean, again, the first thing is depends on who you're talking about. In the report, we have this number: the 1 billion poorest people emit less than 1% of the global emissions. So these people, providing them transport infrastructure, even if it's based on fossil fuels, it's just completely okay. I mean, this is not, they should not be the first one on the line to reduce their almost non-existing emissions. So most of the challenge is for the growing middle class that is accessing cars and especially in cities. And there you have other solutions when it's more like public transport and trying to make the system more efficient. And I think we have first public transit that is limited today by financing capacity. So we have a big role to play in bringing the solutions for the cities to access financing, and they would want to do that. Also limited by governance issues. And for the rest, we have all of those new technologies that are also arriving. So it will be very difficult to bring emissions to zero if we don't have electric cars that can function with renewable energy. So at one point, we will need new technologies to enter the markets. And I think at that point today, I mean, bringing basic transports for the poorest in rural areas is a priority, and bringing public transit in the cities for efficiency reasons and emission reductions is a priority, and this is enough to keep us busy for a little while.
Just to elaborate and maybe state the obvious on this, I think that while we're thinking about what we might do on climate change in a particular sector, I think we've got to be much more rigorous about differentiating the clients we're dealing with. What we're going to do on Kiribati on transport is going to be different from what we're going to do in Chad or Mozambique, and it's going to be different from what we're going to do in China. And the focus, I think we need to make certain that our focus is indeed strategic. As Stefan said, focusing in Kiribati or Chad on fossil fuel emissions doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense, but ensuring that you've got a well-functioning urban transport system, and maybe even together with IFC, figuring out what we can do to start the first generation of electric vehicles, now we're talking something that's strategic, but it really depends on the environment that you're operating in.
So just to add one more thing on the power sector, I think there's beginning to be some very interesting work on building resilience into power sector. There's, as you probably know, some work that's been done in the hydro sector, led by Praveen, that's applying the water decision tree that was developed by the water sector. And Adrien here and another colleague, Judy, who's not here today, have started working with Deb, whose last name I'm not going to try to pronounce, on power sector planning. So how do you use, because it's not just about generation, but what kind of system do we put in place in terms of transmission, in terms of energy mix, and so on and so forth. Anything else? No? Well, thank you very much, and perhaps a final round of applause for our speakers. Thank you.